The Atlanta morning was crisp, the air carrying a quiet promise of the bustling day ahead. Grace Harper walked through the sliding doors of Southview Medical Center with her head held high, even though the weight of the day already pressed down on her shoulders. The hospital was alive with activity, the steady hum of wheels on polished floors, the faint chatter of staff exchanging updates, and the ever-present voice of the PA system announcing overhead. But to Grace, these familiar sounds felt distant, as if a glass barrier separated her from the place she had once considered a sanctuary of healing. Her polished shoes clicked softly against the tile as she made her way to the nurse's station, where Sarah, her colleague and one of the few friendly faces in her daily grind, greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning, Grace. Ready to conquer another day?" Grace returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Always," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with the weariness of someone who knew the battles waiting ahead. As she set her bag down and picked up the patient files, the familiar tension crept into her chest. She had long since learned to mask it behind a professional demeanor, but the sting of unspoken judgments and overt remarks lingered nonetheless. Before they could exchange another word, a figure swept past them with brisk authority. Dr. Andrew Mason, the hospital's lead surgeon and a man whose reputation for brilliance was rivaled only by his reputation for arrogance, moved through the corridor like a gust of icy wind. His white coat billowed slightly behind him as he approached the station, his sharp eyes landing on Grace with a look that sent an immediate chill through her. "Nurse Harper?" he said, his voice clipped and dripping with thinly veiled disdain. "I trust you've managed to organize my patient files correctly this time. We can't afford another one of your oversights." Grace swallowed the retort that threatened to rise in her throat, instead meeting his gaze with an expression of calm professionalism. "Yes, doctor, the files are complete and ready for your review." Dr. Mason arched a brow, his lip curling in a faint sneer. "Good. Let's ensure we maintain those standards moving forward, shall we?" He glanced briefly at Sarah, as if dismissing both her and Grace in the same breath, and strode away without waiting for a response. Grace exhaled quietly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter as she watched him disappear around the corner. The day had begun as it often did, with Grace swallowing the bitter pill of Dr. Mason's condescension while focusing on the work she loved. She turned to Sarah, who gave her a sympathetic look. "Ignore him," Sarah said gently. "He doesn't know what he's talking about." Grace offered a faint smile in return. If only it were that easy. As the morning wore on, Grace followed Dr. Mason during his rounds, her clipboard in hand and her mind focused on the needs of the patients they visited. The hospital corridors felt colder under his shadow, his every word sharp enough to slice through the confidence she fought so hard to maintain. In one room, a young man recovering from surgery greeted Grace with a grateful smile. But before she could respond, Dr. Mason interrupted. "Nurse Harper, pay attention," he snapped. "I need you to focus on the task at hand, not chit-chat with patients. This isn't social hour." Grace bit back a sigh, nodding curtly as she took notes on the man's vitals. She could feel the patient's gaze on her, a mixture of pity and discomfort, but she didn't look up. Every word Dr. Mason directed at her felt like a small, calculated jab, designed to keep her in her place. And yet, she persisted, her focus unwavering as she worked to ensure each patient received the care they needed, even if it meant enduring his constant belittlement. In the next room, as Dr. Mason explained a case to a group of interns following the rounds, he turned to Grace with a pointed glare. "Nurse Harper, try to keep up," he said, his tone laden with condescension. "I know it might be challenging for someone with your background, but precision and intelligence are essential in this field." The comment landed like a slap, and Grace felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She kept her head down, scribbling notes on her clipboard, her hand steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She had heard similar remarks from him before, each one a reminder of the barriers she faced not only as a nurse, but as a Black woman in a predominantly white institution. Yet, she refused to let his words define her. When the rounds finally ended, Dr. Mason dismissed the interns with a wave of his hand and turned to Grace one last time. "I'll expect a full report on today's cases by the end of the day," he said sharply. "Let's hope you don't find a way to mess it up." Grace nodded without a word, her expression calm even as she felt the familiar sting of humiliation. As he walked away, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, steadying her racing heart before moving on to her next task. For her, there was no room to dwell on the hurt. There were patients to care for, lives to touch, and she wasn't about to let Dr. Mason's prejudice stand in her way. By mid-afternoon, Grace found herself in one of her favorite patient rooms, a small corner room with a wide window that let in streams of golden sunlight. Mrs. Ellen Johnson, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery, greeted her with a warm smile as she entered. "How are we feeling today, Mrs. Johnson?" Grace asked, her voice soft and soothing as she adjusted the woman's pillows and checked her vitals. "Much better. Thanks to you, dear," Mrs. Johnson replied, her voice weak but full of warmth. "You have such a kind way about you. It's a rare gift." Grace's heart swelled at the compliment. These moments, however brief, reminded her of why she had chosen this profession. But the peace was short-lived. The door swung open abruptly, and Dr. Mason stepped in, his face set in a scowl. "Nurse Harper," he said sharply, "what are you doing wasting time here? We have work to do." Grace straightened, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "I was ensuring Mrs. Johnson was comfortable, doctor. Her vitals are stable, and I'll determine what's necessary, thank you," Dr. Mason interrupted, his tone cold. "Comfort is not a priority here. Healing is. Now, what are her latest stats?" Grace began to recite the information, but he cut her off again, his voice growing louder with each interruption. A small crowd of nurses and interns had gathered outside the room, drawn by the commotion. "For heaven's sake, can't you even read a chart correctly?" Dr. Mason bellowed, snatching the clipboard from her hands. "This is why we can't afford mediocrity in this field." Mrs. Johnson, visibly distressed by the exchange, reached out and clasped Grace's hand. "Nurse Harper has been nothing but wonderful to me," she said, her voice trembling. "You should treat her with the respect she deserves." Dr. Mason barely spared the elderly woman a glance. "With all due respect, Mrs. Johnson, your opinion isn't relevant here." He turned back to Grace, his expression hard. "I want that report on my desk in an hour. Don't waste any more time." As he stormed out, the onlookers quickly dispersed, their murmured whispers lingering in the air. Grace took a steadying breath and turned to Mrs. Johnson, offering a small smile despite the burn of humiliation in her chest. "Don't worry about me, Mrs. Johnson," she said gently. "Let's focus on getting you back on your feet." As the day wore on, Grace pushed herself through the mounting workload, each task a chance to refocus her energy on what mattered most: her patients. The steady rhythm of tending to vitals, adjusting medications, and offering reassuring smiles became her sanctuary, a way to drown out the echo of Dr. Mason's cruel words. Yet, even in these moments, the weight of his disdain lingered like a shadow. It was nearly evening when Grace found herself in the pediatric ward, checking on a young boy recovering from appendicitis. His small frame was dwarfed by the oversized hospital bed, but his cheerful demeanor made the sterile environment feel less intimidating. Grace adjusted his IV with practiced precision as the boy chattered about his favorite superhero. "Do you think superheroes ever get scared?" he asked suddenly, his wide eyes looking up at her. Grace smiled softly, her heart warming at his innocence. "Even superheroes get scared sometimes," she said gently. "But what makes them heroes is that they don't let fear stop them from doing what's right." The boy nodded thoughtfully, his little fingers fiddling with the blanket. "Then you're like a superhero too," he said with a shy smile. Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you, sweetie," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." Moments like these gave her the strength to keep going, even in the face of adversity. But as she stepped out of the room, her resolve was tested yet again. Just around the corner, she overheard Dr. Mason speaking to one of his colleagues. "I don't know why they keep her around," he said, his voice low but cutting. "It's not like she brings any real value. Probably just a diversity hire." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her clipboard. She stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing with a storm of emotions: hurt, anger, frustration. But then her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "You can't control how others see you, but you can control how you see yourself." Taking a deep breath, Grace straightened her spine and walked away, refusing to let his words break her. She headed to the staff break room, where she could compose herself in private. The small space was empty, and she sank into one of the worn chairs, closing her eyes for a brief moment of solace. The next morning, Grace awoke to sunlight streaming through her curtains. It was her day off, a rare opportunity to step away from the relentless demands of the hospital. She allowed herself the luxury of a slow start, savoring a quiet breakfast and enjoying the simple pleasure of a hot cup of coffee. Deciding to run some errands, Grace drove to a nearby grocery store. The mundane task of shopping felt almost therapeutic, a welcome distraction from the tension that had become a constant in her life. As she wandered the aisles, selecting fresh produce and comparing prices, she found herself smiling at the thought of cooking dinner with her parents later that evening. These small moments of normalcy grounded her, reminding her of the life she had outside the hospital walls. But just as she was placing a carton of eggs into her cart, the peaceful rhythm of her morning was shattered by the screech of tires and the sickening crunch of metal. Grace froze, her heart pounding as she turned toward the sound. Just beyond the edge of the parking lot, a small red car had collided with a streetlight. Smoke rose from the crumpled hood, and the shattered glass glittered on the pavement like tiny diamonds. Grace's nursing instincts kicked in immediately. Abandoning her cart, she sprinted toward the wreckage, her mind racing through emergency protocols. As she reached the car, she saw a teenage boy slumped over the steering wheel, his face pale and bloodied. "Can you hear me?" Grace called out, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. There was no response. She carefully opened the driver's side door, which was bent, but not entirely jammed. The acrid smell of gasoline filled the air, and she knew time was running out. The boy's chest rose and fell weakly, a sign of life, but a deep gash on his forehead bled profusely, and his left leg was pinned beneath the twisted dashboard. Grace assessed his condition quickly, knowing she couldn't move him without risking further injury. But the growing smoke and the faint smell of gasoline left her no choice. "I'm going to get you out of here," she murmured, more to herself than to him. With a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed, Grace carefully maneuvered the boy out of the car, her muscles straining as she dragged him to safety. She laid him on the ground, her hands immediately checking for a pulse. It was faint, but present. Then his breathing stopped. "Stay with me," Grace whispered urgently as she began chest compressions. Her hands pressed against his chest in a steady rhythm, her training taking over completely. Around her, a small crowd had gathered, some filming the scene with their phones while others watched in stunned silence. Grace blocked them out, her focus entirely on the boy. After what felt like an eternity, the boy gasped and coughed, his body jerking slightly as he drew in a shaky breath. Relief flooded through Grace, but she didn't stop. She gently turned him onto his side, keeping his airway clear as she monitored his condition. The wail of approaching sirens broke through the tension, and moments later, paramedics arrived on the scene. Grace briefed them quickly, her voice calm but firm as she relayed the details of the boy's injuries and the care she had already provided. "You saved his life," one of the paramedics said, his tone filled with admiration. Grace nodded, her mind already shifting to the next step. "I'm a nurse at Southview Medical Center. I'd like to ride with him if that's all right." The paramedics agreed, and soon Grace was seated in the back of the ambulance, holding the boy's hand as they sped toward the hospital. His face was pale, his breaths shallow, but he was alive. Grace whispered a silent prayer, her eyes never leaving him. The ambulance raced through the city streets, its siren wailing a relentless reminder of the urgency of their mission. Grace sat beside the stretcher, her hand resting lightly on the boy's as she monitored his vitals. His breaths were shallow, each one a battle, and his pulse, though present, was worryingly weak. The paramedics worked efficiently, securing IV lines and administering oxygen, but Grace's focus remained on the boy's pale face. His eyes fluttered briefly, a flicker of consciousness that disappeared as quickly as it came. "You're going to be okay," Grace murmured, her voice steady but soft. "Just hang in there." The hospital came into view, its imposing facade a beacon of hope in the chaos of the moment. As the ambulance pulled up to the emergency entrance, a team of medical professionals was already waiting, ready to take over. Grace helped guide the stretcher out, quickly briefing the attending physician on the boy's condition as they wheeled him inside. "Teenage male, approximately 16 years old," she began, her tone clipped and professional. "Unconscious at the scene, required CPR to restore breathing, suspected head trauma and potential internal injuries, leg pinned in the crash, possible fractures." The doctor nodded, taking in her words as the team moved swiftly into action. Grace stepped back, her role in the immediate crisis complete. She watched as the boy was whisked away toward surgery, her heart heavy with worry. It wasn't until she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder that she realized someone was speaking to her. "Are you all right?" one of the nurses asked, concern evident in her voice. Grace nodded slowly. "I'm fine," she replied, though the adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving her legs shaky and her thoughts scattered. I need to make sure he's okay." The nurse offered a kind smile. "You did everything you could. He's in good hands now." Grace thanked her and made her way to the waiting area, sinking into one of the hard plastic chairs. The events of the day played over and over in her mind: the crash, the boy's lifeless form, the desperate moments of CPR. Her hands still trembled slightly, and she stared down at them, the smudges of dirt and blood a stark reminder of how close they had come to losing him. She barely noticed the passage of time until the sound of hurried footsteps broke her reverie. Looking up, she saw a man rushing into the emergency room, his face pale and drawn with fear. He was tall, with sharp features and a commanding presence that seemed to demand attention even in his panic. Grace's heart sank as recognition dawned. It was Dr. Mason. "Where is he?" Mason demanded, his voice cracking as he addressed the nearest nurse. "Where's my son?" The nurse gestured toward the surgical wing, but before Mason could take another step, the attending physician intercepted him. Their hushed conversation was tense, the doctor's voice calm but firm as he explained the situation. Grace couldn't hear their words, but she saw the moment Mason's shoulders sagged, the weight of the news pressing down on him like a physical blow. For the first time, Grace saw him not as the overbearing, arrogant surgeon who made her days unbearable, but as a father, terrified and vulnerable. The transformation was jarring, and for a fleeting moment, she felt a pang of sympathy. As Mason turned toward the surgical wing, his eyes met Grace's. He froze, his expression shifting to one of confusion and something that almost resembled shame. Grace held his gaze, her own face unreadable. She wasn't sure what she expected him to say, but he simply nodded stiffly before continuing on his way. Grace remained seated, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Around her, the hospital buzzed with its usual activity, but everything seemed muted, as if the world had narrowed to the thin line between life and death that the boy now walked. She whispered a silent prayer, not for Dr. Mason, but for the young life fighting to survive. Minutes turned into hours as Grace waited, her thoughts a tangled web of hope and fear. She thought of her parents, the strength they had instilled in her, and the countless times they had reminded her of her purpose. She thought of the boy's small hand in hers as she performed CPR, the faint gasp that had signaled a return to life. And she thought of Mason, his face etched with a vulnerability she had never imagined he possessed. When the attending physician finally emerged from the surgical wing, Grace stood, her heart pounding. She watched as he approached Dr. Mason, who had been pacing the corridor like a caged lion. Their conversation was brief, but the relief that washed over Mason's face was unmistakable. The boy had made it through surgery. Grace sat back down, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The tension in her chest eased slightly, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had done her part, and it had mattered. But her respite was short-lived. Moments later, Dr. Mason appeared in front of her, his expression unreadable. He hesitated, his usual confidence replaced by an awkward uncertainty that made him seem almost human. "Nurse Harper," he began, his voice lower than usual. He stopped, running a hand through his hair as he searched for the right words. I was told you were the one who saved my son." Grace met his gaze, her own steady. "I did what anyone would have done," she said simply. "I was in the right place at the right time." Mason's jaw tightened and he looked away briefly before returning his gaze to her. Thank you. For what you did. I can't imagine." He trailed off, his words failing him. For a moment, Grace considered saying something to ease his discomfort, but she decided against it. Instead, she nodded politely. "I hope he recovers quickly, Doctor. Mason. He seems like a strong kid." Mason swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "He is," he said quietly. "He gets that from his mother." The brief exchange left Grace feeling oddly unsettled. She wasn't sure if Mason's gratitude was genuine or if it was simply the result of a father's desperation. Either way, it didn't change the years of disrespect she had endured at his hands. But as she watched him return to his vigil outside the surgical ward, she couldn't help but wonder if this experience might change him. Grace's shift had ended hours ago, but she remained at the hospital unable to bring herself to leave. She checked in with the nurses caring for Mason's son, offering assistance where needed and quietly observing from a distance. When the boy was finally moved to a private recovery room, she followed, ensuring he was stable before slipping away to the break room for a much-needed moment of rest. As Grace settled into the quiet solitude of the break room, she finally allowed herself to relax. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day's chaos was now replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. She leaned back in the chair, her head resting against the wall, and closed her eyes. The events of the day replayed in her mind, each moment vivid and charged with emotion. The boy's pale face as she pulled him from the wreck, the fragile rhythm of his chest rising and falling after she'd performed CPR. Dr. Mason's broken expression as he learned his son had been on the brink of death. It all felt surreal, as if it had happened to someone else. But the ache in her muscles and the smudges of blood still staining her hands told her otherwise. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. She opened her eyes to see Sarah, her closest colleague, stepping into the room. Sarah's face softened when she saw Grace, her usual warmth tinged with concern. "Hey," Sarah said, sitting down across from her. "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" Grace nodded, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice quieter than usual. "Just processing everything." Sarah studied her for a moment, then reached over to place a comforting hand on Grace's arm. "You did something incredible today. That boy is alive because of you." Grace managed a small smile, though her eyes remained troubled. "It's my job," she said simply. "I did what I was trained to do." "That doesn't make it any less extraordinary," Sarah insisted. "And you know what? I heard Dr. Mason actually thanked you. I didn't think he was capable of that." Grace let out a soft, humorless laugh. "It was unexpected, to say the least." "Well, maybe this will finally knock him off his high horse," Sarah said, her tone light but hopeful. "If nothing else, he owes you an apology for the way he's treated you." Grace shrugged, unsure if she believed Mason was capable of such a transformation. "I'm not holding my breath," she said. "But I didn't do it for him. I did it for his son." Sarah nodded, her admiration for Grace evident in her expression. "You're amazing, you know that?" Grace shook her head, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." Sarah didn't argue, but her smile lingered as she stood and squeezed Grace's shoulder. "Take care of yourself, okay? You've had a hell of a day." As Sarah left the room, Grace leaned back once more, her thoughts drifting to her family. She longed for the comfort of her parents' home, the warmth of her mother's cooking, and the steady reassurance of her father's voice. She resolved to leave soon, knowing she needed their strength to face whatever the next day would bring. But before she could gather her things, there was a soft knock at the door. Grace turned, surprised to see Dr. Mason standing in the doorway. His usual air of authority was absent, replaced by an awkward hesitance that seemed foreign to him. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice unusually quiet. Grace hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course, Doctor." Mason stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He looked out of place in the small, unadorned break room, his towering frame and tailored scrubs at odds with the worn furniture and fluorescent lighting. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like an unbridgeable chasm. "I wanted to thank you again," Mason said finally, his tone measured but sincere, "for what you did for my son. I can't imagine what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Grace regarded him carefully, her expression neutral. "I'm glad I could help," she said simply. Mason shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I also wanted to say—" He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I wanted to apologize for the way I've treated you. It was unfair and I was wrong." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their significance. Grace stared at him, unsure if she believed what she was hearing. Mason's arrogance had been a fixture of her daily life for so long that the idea of him admitting fault felt almost surreal. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Mason continued, his voice low. "But I needed to say it. You've shown more professionalism and compassion than I ever have, and I see that now." Grace considered his words, her emotions a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. She could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the cracks in the facade of confidence he had always worn. For the first time, she wondered if there might be more to him than the harsh, unyielding man she had come to know. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice steady. "I appreciate your apology." Mason nodded, his relief palpable. "I'd like to do better," he said, "if you're willing to give me the chance." Grace studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We all have room to grow, Doctor." "Mason, I hope you'll take this as an opportunity to reflect." Mason smiled faintly, his gratitude evident. "I will. Thank you, Grace." As he turned to leave, Grace felt a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. The tension that had weighed on her for so long seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a cautious optimism. Perhaps things wouldn't change overnight, but it was a start. By the time Grace left the hospital that evening, the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the city. As she drove home, she thought about the boy in recovery, about Mason's unexpected apology, and about the strength she had found within herself. When she arrived at her parents' house, the familiar smell of her mother's cooking greeted her, and her father's voice called out from the dining room. "There's our girl." Grace smiled as she stepped inside, the warmth of her family wrapping around her like a protective shield. For the first time in days, she felt truly at peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she could face them with courage, compassion, and the unwavering support of those who loved her. The quiet hospital corridor felt like a place suspended in time, as Grace Harper stood in a rare moment of stillness. She had just returned from checking on Luke Mason, whose condition, thankfully, was steadily improving. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Grace allowed herself to exhale, the tension in her chest loosening slightly. Her shift was far from over, but this brief reprieve felt like a luxury she could scarcely afford. A soft voice broke through her thoughts. "Nurse Harper?" Turning, Grace saw Minda Mason standing a few feet away, her eyes red from hours of tears but carrying a faint glimmer of hope. She stepped forward hesitantly, her movements those of a woman unsure of how to approach the person who had irrevocably changed her family's life. "Mrs. Mason," Grace said, her tone warm but professional. "How is Luke doing? Is there anything I can assist you with?" Minda shook her head quickly and then surprised Grace by reaching out to take her hands. No. Luke is in excellent hands, thanks to you. Her voice wavered, the raw emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I needed to thank you again, properly this time." Grace offered a small, reassuring smile, her calm demeanor a comforting contrast to Minda's trembling form. "There's no need to thank me, Mrs. Mason. I'm just glad Luke is on the mend." But Minda wasn't deterred. Her grip on Grace's hands tightened as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "No, you don't understand," she insisted, her voice breaking. "You didn't just save Luke's life. You saved our family." Grace's eyes softened, and she placed a comforting hand over Minda's. "I'm just glad I could be there to help when it mattered most." As the two women stood together in the quiet hallway, a deep, unspoken understanding passed between them. Grace's humility shone brightly, even in the face of such overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you," Minda whispered again, her voice barely audible. "From the bottom of my heart, thank you." The hospital buzzed with a palpable energy in the days following Luke's accident and miraculous recovery. Word of Grace Harper's actions had spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of Southview Medical Center. Nurses and doctors alike spoke in hushed tones during breaks, their conversations tinged with admiration and awe. "Did you hear about Nurse Harper?" one nurse asked as she poured herself a cup of coffee in the break room. "She's the one who saved Dr. Mason's son." Another nurse raised her eyebrows in disbelief. "The same Dr. Mason who's always giving her a hard time? That's something." A passing doctor paused to join the conversation, shaking his head with a wry smile. "Talk about poetic justice. The nurse he's been belittling for months is the one who saved his child. Life has a funny way of teaching lessons, doesn't it?" The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. Dr. Andrew Mason, once feared and begrudgingly respected for his brilliance but infamous for his arrogance, was now being seen in a new light. The very person he had dismissed and underestimated had become his family's savior. In the quiet of Luke's hospital room, Andrew Mason sat in a chair beside his son's bed, his head resting in his hands. The soft, steady beep of the heart monitor provided a rhythmic backdrop to his thoughts, a constant reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. As he lifted his head to gaze at Luke's sleeping form, a wave of guilt crashed over him, nearly drowning him in its intensity. He replayed every cruel comment, every dismissive glance, and every moment of unnecessary harshness he had directed at Grace. It was as though a floodgate had opened, forcing him to confront the ugliest parts of himself. "What have I done?" he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible in the dimly lit room. Memories of Grace's unwavering professionalism filled his mind. She had never faltered in her duties, even when faced with his condescension. Her calm, steady demeanor had been a constant in the chaos of the hospital, and now, it was the reason his son was alive. He thought about the many times he had allowed his biases and insecurities to cloud his judgment. The realization of his own prejudice stung like salt in an open wound. "I judged her without ever giving her a chance," he murmured to himself, his voice trembling with regret. "She's everything I should strive to be." Andrew Mason stood in the hallway outside the nurse's station, his heart pounding in his chest. He had rehearsed his words a dozen times, but now that the moment was upon him, they seemed inadequate. When Grace Harper finally appeared, her clipboard tucked under one arm and her expression composed as always, Mason felt his resolve falter. But he couldn't back down now. "Nurse Harper," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Could I have a word with you?" Grace turned to face him, her professional mask firmly in place. "Of course, Dr. Mason. Is this about Luke's condition?" Mason hesitated, then shook his head. No, it's not just about that. I wanted to thank you, and to apologize. Grace's expression remained neutral, though her eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. Apologize? He nodded, the weight of his guilt pressing heavily on his shoulders. For the way I've treated you. I've been unfair, unkind, and completely unprofessional. And yet, when it mattered most, you... His voice cracked, and he looked away briefly to collect himself. You saved my son's life without a second thought. I'll never be able to repay you for that. Grace listened quietly, her calm gaze unwavering. When Mason finally fell silent, she nodded. Thank you for your apology, Doctor. Mason, she said, her tone even. I appreciate your honesty. Mason felt a pang of relief at her measured response, though he knew that words alone would never be enough to undo the harm he had caused. I want to do better, he said earnestly, to make this hospital a place where everyone feels respected and valued, and I'd like your help to make that happen. Grace studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she nodded. If you're serious about making real changes, I'll support you. Mason exhaled deeply, gratitude flooding his features. Thank you, Grace. That means more to me than you know. Dr. Mason felt a weight lift from his shoulders, though he understood the path to redemption would be a long one. Grace, ever composed, returned to her duties, her focus unwavering. For her, there were always patients to care for and tasks to complete, and while the apology mattered, it wasn't the focal point of her day. The hospital continued its rhythm, but whispers of change echoed through the halls. Conversations about Mason's newfound humility and Grace's unshakable strength became commonplace. Grace moved through her rounds with her usual efficiency and compassion. Each patient received her full attention, her gentle demeanor bringing comfort to those in pain. Her colleagues noticed her resolve had only grown stronger, her professionalism a quiet reminder of the dedication she had always shown. But something had shifted. Where once there had been polite distance, there was now open respect. Doctors who had previously brushed off her suggestions now sought her input, and nurses who had admired her from afar found themselves inspired to follow her example. Dr. Mason, too, was a changed man. He approached his colleagues with a newfound humility, taking the time to listen and collaborate rather than dictate. In meetings, he openly acknowledged the contributions of others, his tone no longer tinged with superiority. His transformation was evident not only in his interactions with the staff, but also in the care he showed his patients. For the first time in years, he seemed to truly see the humanity in everyone around him. As Luke's recovery progressed, the Mason family found themselves drawn closer together. Minda often stayed late at the hospital, sitting quietly by her son's bedside while Grace checked his vitals. The two women had developed a bond, their shared concern for Luke bridging any gap that might have existed between them. Minda frequently expressed her gratitude, her words heartfelt and sincere, but Grace always responded with the same modest humility. "It's what I'm here to do," she would say, her voice soft but resolute. The hospital staff watched this unlikely friendship with a mix of awe and admiration. Grace, who had once seemed untouchable in her professionalism, now appeared even more remarkable. Her ability to forgive, to rise above, and to maintain her integrity in the face of adversity was a testament to her character. And as Dr. Mason continued to make amends, his actions reinforced the notion that even the most stubborn hearts could change. In the weeks that followed, the Diversity and Inclusivity Initiative began to take shape. Grace, hesitant at first, found herself at the forefront of this new effort. Dr. Mason had insisted she play a central role, and though she was initially unsure of her place, the outpouring of support from her colleagues gave her the confidence to step into the position. Meetings were held to discuss the initiative's goals, and Grace led each session with a calm authority that left little doubt about her leadership abilities. The initiative aimed to address issues of unconscious bias, promote cultural sensitivity, and create a workplace where every voice was heard. Grace approached the task with the same meticulous care she brought to her nursing, ensuring that every detail was considered and every perspective valued. She listened attentively to her colleagues' experiences, taking their stories to heart as she worked to develop training programs and policies that would foster a more inclusive environment. Dr. Mason was an active participant in these efforts, his newfound commitment to change evident in his actions. He shared his own journey during the workshops, admitting his past mistakes with an openness that surprised even himself. "I was blind to my own biases," he said during one session, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It wasn't until I saw the impact of my actions, on Grace, on my colleagues, on my family, that I realized how much I needed to change. And I'm grateful for the chance to do better." Grace listened to these admissions with a quiet understanding. While she appreciated Mason's willingness to take responsibility, she remained focused on the work at hand. For her, the initiative wasn't about one person's transformation. It was about creating lasting change for everyone at the hospital. And as the weeks went by, the results of their efforts began to show. Staff members who had once felt marginalized now found themselves included in important conversations. Meetings that had once been dominated by a few voices were now filled with diverse perspectives. Nurses who had hesitated to speak up felt empowered to share their ideas, and doctors who had previously ignored those around them began to collaborate more openly. The atmosphere in the hospital shifted, the once tense corridors now buzzing with a renewed sense of camaraderie. One afternoon, Grace was reviewing feedback forms from a recent training session when Dr. Mason knocked on her office door. She looked up, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Come in," she said. Dr. Mason stepped inside, his demeanor humble but determined. "I just wanted to thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "For everything you've done, not just for Luke, but for this hospital. Your leadership has made all the difference." Grace nodded, her tone measured as she replied, "It's been a team effort, Dr. Mason. Everyone has contributed to this progress." Mason smiled faintly, the lines on his face softening. "Even so, none of this would have been possible without you. You've shown all of us what true strength looks like." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Grace allowed herself to take them in. She had worked tirelessly to bring about change, and though she had always insisted it was a collective effort, she couldn't deny the pride she felt in what they had accomplished. The changes extended beyond the walls of the hospital. The initiative gained attention from other medical institutions, and Grace found herself invited to speak at conferences and workshops. Her story, once confined to the halls of Southview Medical Center, became a source of inspiration for healthcare professionals across the region. At the annual hospital gala, the impact of the initiative was on full display. Staff members from every department mingled, their interactions filled with genuine warmth and respect. Dr. Mason, uncharacteristically nervous, took the stage to address the gathered crowd. He spoke with a heartfelt honesty that left many in the audience moved to tears. "We are here tonight to celebrate more than just the success of our hospital," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "We are here to celebrate the strength and resilience of our team, and especially the extraordinary woman who has led us through this journey of transformation." His gaze found Grace in the crowd, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. "Nurse Harper," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "your compassion, your professionalism, and your unwavering dedication have changed us all. You saved my son's life, and in doing so, you saved me from myself. I will never be able to thank you enough." The room erupted in applause, and Grace felt a wave of emotion wash over her. As she made her way to the stage, her colleagues reached out to shake her hand and offer words of praise. When she finally stood beside Dr. Mason, she turned to face the crowd, her heart full of gratitude. "This isn't just about one person," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's about all of us working together to create a better future. I'm honored to be a part of this team, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished." The applause that followed was thunderous, a testament to the respect and admiration Grace had earned. As the applause echoed through the grand ballroom, Grace Harper stood at the podium, her heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. The journey that had brought her here was one she never could have anticipated, and yet, standing before her colleagues and peers, she felt a sense of pride that was impossible to ignore. The hospital had come so far, and while she had been at the forefront of the changes, she knew that the transformation was a collective achievement. As the celebration continued, Grace found herself surrounded by colleagues who wanted to express their gratitude and admiration. Sarah, her closest friend at the hospital, approached her with a wide smile and tear-filled eyes. "Grace, that was incredible," she said, pulling her into a warm hug. "You've inspired so many of us, I hope you know that." Grace returned the embrace, her smile soft but genuine. "Thank you, Sarah. But this is just the beginning. There's still so much work to be done." Sarah nodded, her expression filled with admiration. "If anyone can keep us moving forward, it's you." As the night wore on, Grace noticed Dr. Mason standing near the edge of the room, watching the festivities with an introspective look on his face. For a moment, she considered leaving him to his thoughts, but something urged her to approach. She made her way through the crowd, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. When she reached him, Dr. Mason turned, his expression softening as he met her gaze. "Nurse Harper," he began, his tone hesitant but warm. "I wanted to thank you again. Not just for tonight, but for everything. You've changed this hospital in ways I never thought possible." Grace tilted her head slightly, studying him. "It wasn't just me, Dr. Mason. Everyone here played a part." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That may be true, but you were the catalyst, and I'll always be grateful for that." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey hanging between them. Finally, Dr. Mason extended his hand, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. Grace hesitated briefly before taking it, her grip firm and steady. As the weeks turned into months, the changes at Southview Medical Center became deeply ingrained in its culture. The diversity initiative flourished, with Grace continuing to lead workshops and facilitate open discussions among staff. The bulletin board in the cafeteria overflowed with notes of gratitude and stories of kindness, a testament to the impact of their efforts. Dr. Mason remained an active participant in the initiative, his transformation serving as a powerful example of the potential for growth and change. He continued to share his story during training sessions, his vulnerability inspiring others to confront their own biases and strive for better. One day, as Grace was finishing her rounds, she was approached by a young intern named Carla. The intern's cheeks were flushed, and she looked both nervous and determined. "Nurse Harper, do you have a moment?" she asked, her voice tentative. "Of course," Grace replied, her tone encouraging. Carla took a deep breath before speaking. "I just wanted to thank you. Before I started here, I was so scared that I wouldn't fit in, that my voice wouldn't matter. But seeing everything you've done, it's given me the confidence to be myself and to believe that I belong here." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest, her smile soft but genuine. "Thank you for telling me that, Carla. I'm glad to know that the work we've done has made a difference. And remember, your voice does matter. Don't ever forget that." Carla nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I won't. Thank you, Nurse Harper." As the intern walked away, Grace couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. Moments like these reminded her of why she had fought so hard for change. It wasn't just about creating a better environment for herself. It was about paving the way for others to thrive. One evening, Grace found herself walking through the hospital corridors, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The walls that had once seemed cold and unwelcoming now felt alive with possibility. The tension that had once hung heavy in the air had been replaced by a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. As she passed by Luke Mason's old room, she paused, her thoughts drifting to the pivotal moment that had set everything into motion. She could still picture Luke lying there, pale and fragile, his life hanging in the balance. She could still feel the weight of responsibility as she had fought to save him, the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she performed CPR. But more than that, she remembered the look on Dr. Mason's face when he realized what she had done. The mixture of gratitude, shame, and awe had been etched into his features, a turning point not only for him but for the entire hospital. Grace smiled softly to herself before continuing down the hall. She knew that the journey was far from over, but she felt confident in the path they were forging together. One morning, as Grace was preparing for another diversity workshop, she received an email from the hospital's board of directors. The subject line read, "Recognition and Appreciation." Intrigued, she opened the message and read the contents. The email detailed plans to create an annual award in her honor, the Grace Harper Leadership Award. It would be given to a staff member who exemplified the values of compassion, professionalism, and dedication to inclusivity. Grace stared at the screen, her heart swelling with emotion. She hadn't expected such a gesture, and the thought of her name being associated with those ideals filled her with both pride and humility. Later that day, during the workshop, Dr. Mason announced the award to the gathered staff. "This hospital owes so much to Nurse Harper," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Her leadership and unwavering commitment to making this a better place for everyone have set a standard we should all strive to meet. This award is just one way to honor her incredible contributions." The room erupted into applause, and Grace felt her cheeks flush with warmth. She met the eyes of her colleagues, seeing the genuine admiration and respect reflected in their expressions. As the applause died down, Grace stood to address the group. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "But this award isn't just about me. It's about all of us working together to create a hospital where everyone feels valued and respected. I'm honored to be a part of this journey, and I look forward to seeing the incredible things we'll continue to achieve together." The applause that followed was deafening, and as Grace sat down, she couldn't help but feel a profound sense of accomplishment. The road hadn't been easy, but every step had been worth it. As the months went on, Grace Harper became a symbol of change, not just within Southview Medical Center, but throughout the wider healthcare community. News of the hospital's transformation and the role Grace had played spread to other institutions, drawing attention from medical boards and professional organizations. Invitations to speak at conferences and workshops began to pour in, each offering her a platform to share her experiences and the lessons learned during her journey. At first, Grace was hesitant to accept these opportunities. She had always been humble, preferring to let her work speak for itself rather than seek recognition. But her colleagues, particularly Sarah, encouraged her to step forward. "You've done something incredible here," Sarah told her one evening as they reviewed patient charts together. "Sharing your story could inspire others to make changes in their own hospitals. You have a chance to make an even bigger impact." Grace considered Sarah's words carefully. While she felt a deep sense of responsibility to her patients and colleagues, she also recognized that the changes at Southview could serve as a model for other institutions. If her experiences could help foster more inclusive and respectful workplaces elsewhere, then perhaps it was worth stepping out of her comfort zone. Her first speaking engagement was at a regional healthcare summit. As she stood backstage, waiting to be introduced, she felt a familiar flutter of nerves. The audience consisted of doctors, nurses, and administrators from across the region, all eager to hear her story. When her name was announced, the room erupted into applause. Grace stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding but her expression calm and composed. She took a deep breath before addressing the audience. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and clear. "My name is Grace Harper, and I'm a nurse at Southview Medical Center. Today, I want to share with you a story of transformation, a journey that began with challenges and adversity, but ultimately led to growth and change." As she spoke, she recounted the events leading up to the launch of the Diversity Initiative, highlighting the obstacles she had faced and the lessons she had learned. She spoke candidly about the biases and prejudices that had existed within the hospital and the steps they had taken to address them. "I'm not here to present myself as a hero," Grace said, her tone earnest. "I'm here to show that change is possible when we come together with open hearts and minds." It takes courage to confront our own biases and to create spaces where everyone feels valued, but the rewards are worth every effort. Her words resonated deeply with the audience, and when she finished speaking, the applause was deafening. Attendees lined up to speak with her afterward, sharing their own experiences and seeking advice on how to implement similar initiatives in their institutions. Grace returned to Southview with a renewed sense of purpose. She shared her experiences from the summit with her colleagues, and together, they worked to refine and expand their own programs. The hospital continued to thrive under her leadership, and the atmosphere of respect and collaboration only grew stronger. Dr. Mason, too, continued his personal journey of growth. His transformation was evident not only in his interactions with colleagues, but also in the way he approached his work. He became a mentor to younger doctors, offering guidance and encouragement without the condescension that had once defined him. One afternoon, as Grace was wrapping up a meeting with the diversity committee, Dr. Mason approached her with a thoughtful expression. "Nurse Harper," he began, his tone warm and respectful, "I've been thinking about the impact we've made here and how we can continue to build on it. I'd like to propose that we create a mentorship program for staff members from underrepresented backgrounds. I think it could make a real difference." Grace considered his suggestion, her expression thoughtful. "That's an excellent idea, Dr. Mason," she said. "A mentorship program could help foster a sense of belonging and provide valuable support for those who might feel isolated." Dr. Mason nodded, his enthusiasm evident. "I'd like you to lead the effort, if you're willing. Your insight and experience would be invaluable." Grace smiled softly. "I'd be honored to help. Let's discuss the details and get started as soon as possible." The mentorship program was launched a few months later, and it quickly became one of the hospital's most successful initiatives. Staff members from diverse backgrounds were paired with mentors who provided guidance, encouragement, and opportunities for professional growth. The program not only strengthened individual careers, but also fostered a sense of unity and mutual support among the staff. As the program flourished, Grace found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about the early days of her career, when she had struggled to find her place in a challenging and often unforgiving environment. She thought about the moments of doubt and frustration, the times she had questioned whether her efforts would ever make a difference, but most of all, she thought about the people who had supported her along the way, her parents, who had instilled in her the values of compassion and resilience, Sarah, who had been her confidant and cheerleader, and even Dr. Mason, whose transformation had shown her the power of redemption and the importance of perseverance. One evening, Grace received a letter from a young nurse who had attended one of her workshops. The letter was heartfelt and raw, expressing gratitude for the inspiration Grace had provided. "I used to feel invisible in my workplace," the letter read. "But hearing your story gave me the courage to speak up and demand the respect I deserve. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to make a difference, even in the face of adversity." As Grace read the letter, she felt a lump form in her throat. It was moments like these that reminded her of the ripple effect her actions had created. The changes at Southview were just the beginning. The impact of her work was spreading far beyond the hospital walls. Dr. Mason continued to be one of her strongest allies, and their professional relationship evolved into a partnership built on mutual respect and admiration. They often collaborated on new initiatives, each bringing their unique perspectives and strengths to the table. One day, as they were preparing for a presentation on the mentorship program, Dr. Mason turned to Grace with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, his tone reflective, "when I think about everything we've accomplished, I realize how much I've learned from you. You've not only made me a better doctor, but a better person." Grace met his gaze, her expression soft but firm. "And you've shown me that people can change, Dr. Mason. That's something I'll always carry with me." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sarah entered, a clipboard in hand and a bright smile on her face. "Are you two ready? The board is eager to hear about the program." Dr. Mason and Grace exchanged a glance before nodding. As they walked to the conference room, Grace felt a sense of pride and purpose that was impossible to ignore. Together, they had turned a place of tension and division into a beacon of hope and progress. And as they stood before the board, presenting their vision for the hospital's future, Grace couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was long, but she was ready to face it, one step at a time. As Grace Harper and Dr. Mason concluded their presentation to the board, the room erupted into applause. The initiative's success and the hospital's transformation were undeniable, and their efforts had set a benchmark for institutions across the healthcare industry. Grace felt a deep sense of pride, not just in her own contributions, but in the collective effort of everyone at Southview Medical Center. After the meeting, the board members approached Grace individually, offering words of praise and gratitude. One of them, an older man with a kind smile, took her hand and said, "You've accomplished something extraordinary here, Nurse Harper. What you've done will leave a lasting legacy, not just for this hospital, but for healthcare as a whole." Grace thanked him humbly, her mind already racing with ideas for the next steps in their journey. She knew that progress was not a destination but an ongoing process, one that required constant attention and effort. In the days that followed, Grace threw herself back into her work, balancing her duties as a nurse with her responsibilities as the leader of the diversity initiative. The mentorship program continued to flourish, with more staff members volunteering as mentors and sharing their experiences with the new hires. It wasn't long before other hospitals began reaching out to Southview for guidance, eager to implement similar programs in their own institutions. One such hospital invited Grace to visit and share her insights with their leadership team. The invitation came with an air of urgency, as the hospital had been facing challenges with morale and staff retention. Grace accepted, recognizing the opportunity to extend the impact of her work even further. The visit was eye-opening. As she walked through the hospital corridors, she saw echoes of the environment Southview had once been: strained relationships, disengaged staff, and an undercurrent of unspoken tension. During her meeting with the leadership team, Grace spoke candidly about her experiences and the steps Southview had taken to address similar issues. "It starts with listening," she told them. "You can't create meaningful change unless you understand the challenges your staff are facing. Give them a platform to share their experiences, and then take action based on what you learn." Her words resonated deeply, and by the end of her visit, the hospital's leadership was inspired to begin their own journey of transformation. Grace returned to Southview feeling both hopeful and motivated. She knew that the road ahead would be challenging for the other hospital, but she was confident in their ability to make progress if they remained committed to the cause. Back at Southview, the culture of inclusivity and respect continued to grow. The bulletin board in the cafeteria, once a small space for notes of gratitude, had expanded into a wall-sized display filled with colorful messages from staff and patients alike. Stories of kindness, teamwork, and personal growth covered every inch of the board, serving as a daily reminder of the hospital's journey. One morning, as Grace walked past the wall, she noticed a note written in familiar handwriting. It read, "Nurse Harper, you've taught me what it means to be a true leader. Your strength and compassion have inspired me to be better every day. Thank you for showing me the way. Andrew Mason." Grace felt her chest tighten as she read the note. It was a simple gesture, but it carried profound meaning. Dr. Mason's transformation had been one of the most unexpected and rewarding outcomes of the initiative, and this small acknowledgement of her impact was deeply moving. Later that day, Grace crossed paths with Dr. Mason in the hallway. She stopped him with a gentle smile. "I saw your note on the wall," she said softly. "Thank you. It means a lot to me." Dr. Mason returned her smile, his expression warm and sincere. "It's the least I could do. You've changed my life, Grace. I'll always be grateful for that." Their relationship, once fraught with tension and animosity, had evolved into one of mutual respect and camaraderie. They worked together seamlessly, their shared vision for the hospital uniting them in purpose. As the seasons changed, so did the hospital. The diversity initiative continued to evolve, With new programs and policies being introduced regularly, staff members who had once felt voiceless now played active roles in shaping the hospital's future, and the sense of unity among the team was stronger than ever. One day, Grace received a call from a national healthcare organization. They had heard about her work at Southview and wanted to feature her story in their annual conference. The conference was one of the largest in the industry, and the opportunity to share her experiences on such a prominent stage was both exciting and daunting. After much consideration, Grace accepted the invitation. She spent weeks preparing her presentation, carefully crafting her message to ensure it would resonate with a diverse audience. When the day of the conference arrived, she stood backstage, her heart racing with anticipation. As she stepped onto the stage, the auditorium erupted into applause. The sight of hundreds of healthcare professionals gathered to hear her story was overwhelming, but Grace took a deep breath and steadied herself. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and confident. "My name is Grace Harper, and I'm a nurse who believes in the power of compassion, collaboration, and courage to create meaningful change." She spoke about the challenges she had faced at Southview, the turning points that had led to the hospital's transformation, and the lessons she had learned along the way. Her words were met with nods of agreement, murmurs of appreciation, and even a few tears from those in the audience who saw their own experiences reflected in her story. When she finished, the applause was deafening. Attendees lined up to ask her questions, share their own challenges, and seek her advice. Grace felt a profound sense of fulfillment as she realized the ripple effect her work was creating. Back at Southview, her colleagues greeted her with enthusiasm, eager to hear about her experience at the conference. Sarah, as always, was one of the first to congratulate her. "You're becoming a bit of a celebrity, Grace," Sarah teased with a grin. Grace laughed, shaking her head. "Hardly. I'm just doing my part." But deep down, she felt a growing sense of responsibility to continue using her platform to advocate for change. She knew that the work they had started at Southview was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and she was determined to do everything she could to make a difference. As the hospital continued to thrive, Grace found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the challenges she had faced, the relationships she had built, and the lives she had touched along the way. And as she walked through the corridors of Southview, greeting patients and colleagues with her characteristic warmth, she felt a sense of pride and purpose that was impossible to ignore. This was more than just a job. It was a calling, and she was exactly where she was meant to be,